as the researcher, need to be careful not to throw my weight on the participants. In many cases, I'm an educator, and in many cases, my participants would either be learners or other educators or people who report to me in terms of work. It becomes difficult for them to say no when I say, can we do this? So that's my little understanding of what positionality is. It cannot be, in my opinion, avoided because we live in a community, in a society that is structured in such a way that there will always be someone who reports to someone. And even though you would want the participants to be at ease and to be comfortable, but there will always be that hierarchical setup. That's just the way society is. And so the question that I keep asking myself is, should we then put a rule that says I cannot conduct research with people who are my subordinates or people who may feel vulnerable when they're with me? Then it would mean in the education sector, there's no research, because you seldom have a situation where learners research their teachers, except at university, of course. You could have a student, a master's or a PhD student who does that, but it would mean there's very little research that goes on. And I do think it is important for us to be able to research our own practice and the practice of the people around us. And so we cannot therefore avoid the issue of one researching or dealing with people who are vulnerable to him or her as a researcher. I therefore feel that maybe for us in the education faculty, it might be a little stretched too far. I would be comfortable with us saying we should be mindful of the fact that the people that I'm dealing with are maybe vulnerable, and I must be careful of that. But I'm looking at it, unfortunately, the way it comes up in our ethics setup, and I'm not blaming anyone here, I'm just looking at the general ethics rules. It comes up as if you are suddenly an enemy to the people that you are going to. And yet these are people we live with, people we work with. Let's say I'm in a high school and I'm the principal, and I would like to research in the classrooms of the teachers. I do work with them. I do visit their classrooms. They have powers to talk to me. Yes, they report to me. And yes, they can, find it difficult to say no and so on and to be open. But the truth is, under normal circumstances, they work with me. Under normal circumstances, they interact with me. They can say no to me. That's the reality. Versus the ethics form, which says they may not. I feel it's a little too stretched. I'll give you an example of my research, for instance. When I was doing my PhD recently, my participants were my students. And these are not children. They are adults. They are teachers. I'm in service, teaching the sector of in-service. So I interviewed real teachers, went into their classes, and they could tell me what they want. They could challenge me. They could even challenge some of the concepts that we teach them, in the classroom and so on. We say to them, you must follow this theory, you must do this and that. And they could tell me when I was going to their classes to do the interviews, to do the observations, they could tell me that, the theory that you are saying we must use is not practical in my context. Look at this and that. They were way stronger than me as a researcher. I was more on the listening. And yet the ethical forms said that they are vulnerable because of, that was just an example to show. However, when it is people who are your subordinates, they would, prioritize you. So there is that difference. That is a reality. There is that difference, which one needs to be mindful of. The other fear, when you deal with people who report to you, so to say, is they may want to tell you what they think you want to hear, and that would affect the output, the very thing that you are trying to establish.
And how do you address it when you notice that there may be the risk that your participants will tell you what you want to hear to please you or to access to a particular intervention? How do you address it?
What I did in the few instances that I've had to deal with this was I used my relationship with them. I jumped onto their side, so to say. I said to them, look, I would like you to help me here. I am trying to establish this, and I don't want you to tell me what you think I want to hear. I just need to solve this. Can you be part of this? Can you just assist me to get the answer to this question that I'm searching for?
I am a middle-aged white woman. I'm a professor of higher education studies. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a lover, a friend, a doodler, an occasional runner, a technophile, and much more. I draw on critical and social theories to try to make sense of the world. I am skeptical of claims that suggest simple causal relationships in events in the social world. And I'm always looking to see whose interests are being served in any context. So which of these positions, and the many others that I hold, most influences my research? I suspect that they all do, though some might dominate and some might be more in the background, depending on the specific nature of the research I'm doing. In a highly raced society, I suspect that my being white, for example, may mean that some of my research participants bring assumptions about me into the room before we've even begun. On the other hand, my being raised white South African during apartheid means that I've got all sorts of barely visible privileges, and I probably have a lot of blind spots in how I view the world. So for me, positionality is about much more than my position. Perhaps aspects of my data collection might be affected by my position in the university, which is Director of Postgraduate Studies, but I think it goes far beyond that. Positionality for me is about how everything about my being affects my research, both my outer being and how I present to the world, and my inner being and how I make sense of the world. Geometa 2018 says that the words researchers use and where they are situated influence their sensibilities as investigators of the social. And the seminal article, 1988 article by Donna Haraway, argues that knowledge is always situated in a specific context. So it is not just who I am that constitutes my positionality in a study, but it's also what theoretical lenses I wear and what those lenses allow me to bring into focus and what they possibly hide from view. I see that increasingly students around the world are being asked to write positionality statements in their research proposals and in their ethical clearance applications. I mean, you can even Google ready-made positionality statements and then just insert your study details. And it worries me that increasingly we are demanding things of students that we interpret or that the students interpret in a very technicist way. I think it's really problematic. I think thinking through my positionality entails a lot of reflexivity, in other words, reflection plus action. But given that much of my positionality emerges from my own assumptions and my own blind spots, you can't actually do this work entirely on your own. So reading texts that challenge my understandings of a phenomenon is helpful to me, and asking colleagues for feedback on my thinking is also helpful. But I think the challenge there is to try and read texts that don't have you just nodding in agreement, but actually make you feel uncomfortable or even irritated, and think through why you react in the way that you do. And when you ask colleagues for feedback, I think it's really important to include colleagues who you know have different life worlds or different views to your own. Another positionality issue that I often come up against in my own research is what Kevin Williams in his 2009 paper calls guilty knowledge. That is when you're doing insider research within your own organization, for example, and you bring all sorts of contextual understandings to the data that an outsider would not be privy to. But even those understandings will be tempered by your own views about the context. There's also an increasingly frequent discussion around positionality, which argues that only certain people have got the necessary gaze or identity to make sense of certain kinds of data, certain life experiences. In other words, only a lesbian feminist should be allowed to study lesbian feminism because only they can fully understand that experience. I think I take a bit of a middle line on this. I think if we take that to extremes, it will mean that we can only ever research ourselves, and we can only share our research with ourselves. But I also see that there are going to be very large blind spots in our understanding if our research is us researching the other. And we are trying to make sense of the other from within our own lenses. I once ran a research design workshop where a male school principal was designing narrative research on why schoolgirls fall pregnant. And I chatted to him and I got a sense of his views. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't convince him that he was not the right person to do this research. I mean, possibly with sufficient criticality and engagement with the literature, he could do the study. But I think his position, and here I mean both his position in the school, male authority figure, but also his position in terms of his belief system. He believed that these girls were wayward and that they fell pregnant without kind of no focus on anyone else who was involved. I think that meant that it was just a really bad idea for him to do that research, and I sincerely hope that the ethics committee or the higher degrees committee would have stopped it, because his own supervisor actually thought that he was very well placed to do that research. So I think reflection on your positionality can sometimes hopefully bring you to the conclusion that maybe you shouldn't be doing that research. In my own PhD, I included a personal narrative within my literature review where I looked back on and framed my own work experience alongside the literature, and looked at the very slow way in which I had become aware of my own complicity in the autonomous model that I was critiquing in my PhD. And I remember worrying at the time that it may seem a bit self-indulgent, but I think that task of confronting my positionality in my PhD study stood me in very good stead for undertaking that kind of reflection in the research that I've done since then. I don't think I've got the issue of positionality right in any of the studies I've done. I doubt I ever will, but at least I know enough to reflect as best I can on what I am doing in my research and how it is that my position positions me in that research. I hope that was helpful.
And our project, we form a community of practice which is guided by principles of Ubuntu, which is something not that we've learned in books, but, our mothers breastfed us actually with Ubuntu, So we believe that who we are does count when doing research. and you can't distance yourself. And as I say, that the research projects are informed by principles of Ubuntu, central to which is respect. And now we work with our students work with teachers, some work with learners, some work with community members. Why community members? We believe that they might, in quotes, not be referred to as educated because they don't have the certificates, However, they've got lots of funds of knowledge and wisdom. And we try to tap into that knowledge and see if we can say, actually, science, our moms, when they cook in the kitchen, they're actually doing science, and we need to embrace that. The problem with colonization was that it denigrated other ways of knowing and kind of portrayed science as the absolute truth. And now in our project, we say other ways of knowing, other ways of thinking, and even other ways of being are very important. And you can't embrace that if you don't have respect. And so in terms of now positionality, which we combine with reflexivity, because we don't want to separate the two, entails acknowledging that, for example, community members are custodians of this knowledge. And it's very useful knowledge that we can use to contextualize and make science relevant to learners. When working with community members in particular, so we position ourselves as co-learners rather than putting ourselves on the pedestal. And we believe that indigenous knowledge system and westernized science, because there's no such thing as Western, is that these knowledges are intersecting somehow. So we look at the nexus or intersection of these and look at the commonalities. Of course, we do agree that there are issues when it comes to indigenous practices which are very difficult to explain scientifically. And we don't have to, for example, issues of spirituality. And we have to respect people we work with, even though they might have, certain Christian beliefs and all that, and not to impose our so-called, westernized science on them. Indeed, we're not doing research on them. Instead, we do research with them.
I'm trying to grasp, in the terrain, in the ground. How do you approach that positionality? What are the practical considerations that you take into account? Yes.
Yeah, first and foremost is that if you put aside research, for example, as I speak to you, we are bereaved in the family. We're very bereaved. My wife and I have just been there to give moral support, to say we are part of the community. So the danger when you get educated, you can't distance yourself from your community and who you are. And that's why I say that, when coming to institutions like Rhodes University, you can't leave your culture at the doorstep and identity and come here because it's a former white institution. You have to come with, for example, issues of respect. And now, first of all, how do we approach people? Now, when you work with communities, first thing, if they offer you something like cup of tea, you can't say no. Because when you accept that, you're saying, I'm part of your family. Second thing, clan names. So you mustn't lose sight of where you come from and respect people's knowledge, appreciate what they do, and in that way, you get them to understand that they have something to contribute. At university, sometimes I feel we're making a huge mistake in that we pride ourselves in developing knowledge. But for whom are we developing that knowledge? And now, does it mean that in the communities, is there no knowledge that we can use to strengthen the knowledge? My answer is yes, there is knowledge.
I have a final question. What would you expect to see in a research proposal if someone like me that says that I'm going to do an intervention into study that is exposed to a community that has a different cultural background? Let's say I'm going to do an intervention in one of the schools in Grahamstown that most of the students come from isiXhosa backgrounds. What would you expect to see in terms of positionality and reflexivity?
Well, in first of all, you need to try and understand and embrace other cultures. Sadly, the ethics we're using are Eurocentric. They are not from an African perspective. For example, verbal agreement to indigenous people is more important than written. In fact, written is so scary because it binds you, even though you say they are free to. Now, in terms of that statement, that you can withdraw at any time you feel like, if you translate that into isiXhosa, ungayeka nanini na ufuna, that is interpreted to mean that actually you don't care for. Because by our nature as Africans, we are a collective. Now, when you make that statement now, it sends wrong messages. So I would say, now, if you work with community members solely because you can't speak isiXhosa, you need to collaborate with someone who knows the language. For example, two of us collaborating